On February 26, 2022, 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and the European Union made a decision that would change the global financial system forever. They announced that Russia would be cut off from SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. To understand why this matters, imagine if every single international payment in the world suddenly went silent. SWIFT is the messaging system that connects 11,000 banks in 200 countries. It processes $5 trillion in transactions every single day. That's not a typo. $5 trillion. Every day. Cutting Russia off meant Russian banks couldn't send or receive international payments. No trade finance, no cross-border transactions. Complete economic isolation. The West celebrated this as the nuclear option of financial sanctions. Russia would be crippled. The ruble would collapse. The economy would implode. Putin would be forced to withdraw from Ukraine or face revolution at home. But here we are, almost 3 years later, and something unexpected happened. Russia didn't collapse. The ruble recovered. Russian trade continued, just not through SWIFT. And here's what nobody in Washington wanted to admit. Russia found alternatives. Worse for the West, dozens of other countries saw what happened and began building their own alternatives. Because if the US could cut Russia off from the global financial system for political reasons, it could cut off anyone. This is the story of how America's most powerful weapon became its greatest strategic mistake. This is the story of how financial dominance does not with a bang, but with a whimper. Before I show you how the SWIFT weapon backfired, you need to understand what SWIFT actually is and why it became so powerful. SWIFT isn't a bank. It doesn't hold money. It doesn't transfer money. SWIFT is a messaging system. Think of it as the postal service for banks. When Bank of America in New York wants to send $1 million to Mitsubishi Bank in Tokyo, SWIFT transmits the secure message between them. The message says, Bank of America authorizes transfer of $1 million to Mitsubishi Bank, account number XYZ. The actual money moves through correspondent banking relationships, a complex web of bank accounts that banks hold with each other. But SWIFT is the communication network that makes it all possible. Without SWIFT, international banking goes back to the Stone Age. SWIFT was created in 1973 by 239 banks in 15 countries. Before SWIFT, international payments used telex, an old telegram system. It was slow, insecure, and prone to errors. A single typo could send millions to the wrong account. SWIFT standardized messaging, created security protocols, and made cross-border transactions fast and reliable. By 1977, SWIFT was processing 10 million messages per year. By 2024, it's over 11 billion messages per year, about 45 million every single day. SWIFT became the nervous system of global finance. If you cut off from SWIFT, you're essentially cut off from the modern banking world. Here's what makes SWIFT powerful. It's technically based in Belgium, supposedly neutral, but its board is dominated by American and European banks, and the US has enormous legal leverage because most international transactions ultimately settle in US dollars through New York banks. This means the US can pressure SWIFT to exclude countries or banks, and if you're cut off from SWIFT, you can't easily conduct international trade. You're economically isolated. The US has used this weapon before. In 2012, the United States pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks. This was devastating for Iran. Iran's economy depended heavily on oil exports. When SWIFT cut them off, buyers couldn't pay for Iranian oil through normal banking channels. Oil exports collapsed by 50%. Iran's economy contracted by 9% in a single year. Inflation hit 45%. The Iranian rial lost 80% of its value. This was economic warfare without firing a shot. The sanctions forced Iran to negotiate, eventually leading to the 2015 nuclear deal. The SWIFT weapon worked, or so it seemed. But here's what American policymakers missed. Iran spent those years building alternative payment channels. They developed barter arrangements with trading partners. They experimented with cryptocurrency. They established non-dollar trade relationships with China, Russia, and Turkey. When Trump reimposed sanctions in 2018, Iran survived better than in 2012. Why? Because they had reduced their SWIFT dependency. They had learned the lesson: never be completely dependent on a system your enemy controls. But Iran is a relatively small economy. The real test came in 2022, with Russia. This wasn't the first time a dominant power weaponized financial infrastructure. It's happened 4 times in the last 110 years, and every single time, the same 5-stage pattern played out. Stage 1. The dominant power controls the financial system. Stage 2. The dominant power weaponizes that system to punish enemies. Stage 3. The targets find alternatives. Stage 4. Neutral countries hedge their bets. Stage 5. The original weapon loses power. The dominant power thinks it's wielding ultimate leverage, but it's actually destroying the foundation of its own dominance. Let me show you the 4 historical examples. Example 1. Britain in World War I, 1914 to 1918. Before World War I, The British pound was the world's reserve currency. The City of London was the center of global finance. Britain controlled about 65% of international reserves. When war began in August 1914, Britain passed the Trading with the Enemy Act. This law allowed Britain to freeze assets of German nationals and companies. Britain seized German-owned businesses, bank accounts, ships, and property throughout the British Empire. This was unprecedented. For centuries, international finance had been separate from war. Belligerents fought on battlefields, but they honored financial contracts. Your money was safe in London even if Britain was at war with your country. Britain broke this centuries-old norm. The immediate effect was devastating for Germany. German companies lost assets worldwide. German banks couldn't access London markets. German trade collapsed. Britain thought this gave them decisive advantage. But neutral countries watched and learned a dangerous lesson. If Britain could seize German assets, it could seize anyone's assets during any conflict Britain deemed important. Your money in London wasn't safe unless Britain approved of your government. After WWI, neutral countries began diversifying reserves away from London. They increased gold holdings. They established accounts in New York, Paris, and other financial centers. The United States benefited enormously. New York banks gained business that previously went to London. By 1920, the US held more gold reserves than Britain. By 1925, New York rivaled London as a financial center. By 1944, at Bretton Woods, the dollar formally replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain's financial weaponization in 1914 started a 30-year decline from dominance to irrelevance. Example 2. United States and Iran 1979, when Iranian revolutionaries took American hostages in November 1979. President Carter froze all Iranian assets in U.S. banks, about $12 billion, including $8 billion in bank deposits and $4 billion in other assets. This was the largest asset freeze in history at the time. The justification was clear. Iran had violated international law by taking hostages. The U.S. was defending its citizens. The freeze put pressure on Iran to release the hostages. But the freeze had unintended consequences. Countries around the world, especially in the Middle East and OPEC, suddenly realized that dollar reserves held in U.S. banks could be seized, not through military conquest, not through default, just through executive order. The president could freeze your assets with a phone call. Your sovereign wealth wasn't sovereign if it was in dollars in New York. In the 1980s and 1990s, OPEC countries diversified reserves. They increased holdings in European currencies, Japanese yen, and gold. They kept less in U.S. Treasury bonds. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds invested globally instead of concentrating in U.S. assets. The dollar remained dominant, but the Iran freeze planted seeds of doubt about dollar safety. Example 3. United States and Iraq, 1990 to 2003. After Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the United States froze Iraqi assets and imposed comprehensive sanctions through the United Nations. Iraqi banks were cut off from international finance. Iraqi oil sales were restricted. These sanctions lasted 13 years, from 1990 to 2003. They devastated Iraq's economy but didn't topple Saddam Hussein. Instead, Iraq developed elaborate sanctions evasion networks. The UN's oil forfeit program, intended to provide humanitarian relief, became a massive corruption scheme. Iraq smuggled oil through Jordan, Syria, and Turkey. Iraq traded with Russia and China using barter and non-dollar arrangements. By 2003, when the US invaded Iraq, Saddam's regime was weakened but still functioning. The sanctions had created a gray market economy that operated outside Western financial systems. More importantly, countries like Russia and China learned how to help sanctioned regimes evade restrictions. These networks would prove crucial when Russia faced sanctions in 2022. Example 4. United States and Venezuela. 2017, 2020, and 2017. The Trump administration imposed financial sanctions on Venezuela, targeting state oil company PDVSA and restricting Venezuela's access to U.S. financial markets. Venezuela responded by launching the Petro, a cryptocurrency supposedly backed by oil reserves. It failed as a currency, but it signaled something important. Sanctioned countries would experiment with any alternative to U.S.-controlled systems. Venezuela also deepened trade with China and Russia, accepting yuan and rubles for oil. Venezuela used gold sales to Turkey and UAE to generate hard currency. Venezuela survived barely, but it survived without dollars and without SWIFT. Each of these examples followed the same pattern. The U.S. used financial power as a weapon. The target suffered but found workarounds. And neutral countries learned to reduce dependence on U.S.-controlled systems. By 2022, when the U.S. cut Russia off from SWIFT, the pattern was well established. Russia had watched Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela. Russia knew what to do. Let's trace the 5-stage pattern with Russia post-2022. Stage 1. US controls the system pre-2022. Before February 2022, about 60% of global reserves were in dollars. SWIFT handled 42 million messages per day. Most international trade settled in dollars through New York banks. The US had ultimate financial power. Stage 2. US weaponizes the system. February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. The US and EU freeze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, the largest asset seizure in history. Russia is cut off from SWIFT. Russian banks can't access dollar clearing. Maximum pressure. Stage 3. Russia finds alternatives. March-December 2022. Russia activates SPF's system for transfer of financial messages. CIPS SWIFT. Alternative launched in 2014 after Crimea annexation. SPFS handles domestic Russian transactions and connects to banks in China, India, and former Soviet states. Russia expands use of CIPS chainless cross-border interbank payment system. CIPS processed 80 million messages in 2021. By 2023, it's processing 130 million messages. Russia settles oil and gas sales in yuan with China, rupees with India, and rubles with friendly nations. Russia increases gold purchases. By the end of 2022, Russia's economy contracted only 2.1%, far less than the 10 to 15% predicted by Western economists. The ruble recovered from its March crash. Russian oil exports continued at near-normal levels, just to different buyers at different prices. Stage 4. Neutral countries hedge 2023 to 2024. This is where it gets really interesting. It's not just Russia adapting, it's everyone watching Russia adapt. China accelerates de-dollarization in 2022. 70% of China's trade with Russia was in rubles and yuan. By 2024, over 90%. China signs currency swap agreements with 40-plus countries allowing bilateral trade without dollars. Saudi Arabia breaks the petrodollar in June 2023. Saudi Arabia announces it will accept yuan for oil sales to China. This is enormous. Since 1974, Saudi Arabia only sold oil in dollars. That's what made the petrodollar system work. When Saudi Arabia breaks this, the petrodollar system begins to crumble. BRICS expansion. In 2023, BRICS invites 6 new members: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina. These aren't just geographic additions, they're countries that want alternatives to dollar dominance. BRICS nations now represent 36% of global GDP and 46% of global population. Central banks buy gold in 2022 and 2023. Central banks purchased 2,000 tons of gold, the highest in 50 years. Why? Because gold can't be frozen by executive order. Gold is the ultimate neutral reserve asset. India plays both sides. India maintains relations with Russia despite US pressure. India buys Russian oil at discounts, pays in rupees, and faces no serious consequences. This is the future for middle powers. More autonomy, less US dominance. Stage 5. The weapon loses power. 2024. Present by 2024. The SWIFT weapon is effectively neutered. Why? Because anyone the US might target in the future has already built alternatives or is building them now. If the US threatened to cut off China, China has CIPs. If the US threatened to cut off India, India has UPI and bilateral trade agreements. If the US threatened to cut off Saudi Arabia can sell oil in yuan. The SWIFT weapon worked once against Russia. It will never work again because the world learned the lesson. Build alternatives. Diversify away from dollars. Never be vulnerable to US financial power. Let me show you the exact data proving this is happening. Dollar share of global reserves. 2000, 71%, 2010, 62%, 2020, 59%, 2024, 58%. That looks like slow decline, right? But look at what happened post-SWIFT sanctions. Q1 2022 before sanctions, 59.0% Q for 2023, 58.2% in 18 months. The dollar lost almost a full percentage point. That might not sound like much, but remember, we're talking about trillions of dollars in global reserves. 1 percentage point is about $150 billion shifting out of dollars. SWIFT versus alternatives. SWIFT messages, 11 billion per year. CIPS messages, 130 million per year 2023, up from 80 million 2021. SPFS messages, classified, but estimated 2 million per day in 2024. CIPS grew 62% in 2 years. That's exponential growth in dollar alternatives. Yuan internationalization. Yuan share of global payments, 2% in 2022, 4.5% in 2024. Yuan share of China-Russia trade, 23%. In 2022, 95% in 2024. Yuan share of global reserve, 2.3% in 2022, 3.2% in 2024. The yuan is still small globally, but it's growing fast. and growth is concentrated in regions that matter: Asia, Middle East, Africa. Gold purchases. Central bank gold purchases 2022, 1,136 tons. Central bank gold purchases 2023, 1,037 tons. 50-year high. Who's buying? China, Russia, Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore. Not coincidentally, these are countries either targeted by US sanctions or worried about being targeted. Petrodollar breakdown 1974 to 2023. Saudi Arabia sells oil exclusively in dollars. June 2023. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for Chinese purchases. 2024. 20% of Saudi oil sales to China in yuan. Once the petrodollar breaks, dollar dominance has a clock on it. Winners. China wins everything. China is building the alternative financial architecture CIPS. Yuan internationalization, Belt and Road lending, digital yuan. China didn't defeat the US militarily. China is winning by offering an alternative to dollar hegemony. As the dollar declines, the yuan rises. China becomes the financial center of Asia, then the world. This process is accelerated by American financial weaponization. Russia wins strategically. Russia's economically smaller than China, but Russia proved you can survive swift cutoff. This demonstration effect is crucial. Every country that feared US financial power now knows there's an alternative. Russia's survival destroyed the myth of US financial omnipotence. BRICS nations win. Brazil, India, South Africa, and new members gain leverage. They can play us, China, and EU against each other. They're not trapped in dollar dependence. Gold wins. When countries lose trust in fiat currencies, they buy gold. Alternative payment systems win: CIPS, SPFS, UPI in India, PIX in Brazil. Cryptocurrency exchanges. Any system that allows non-dollar, non-SWIFT transactions gains market share. Losers. The United States loses hegemony. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but gradually and irreversibly. The dollar's reserve status is the foundation of American power. It allows unlimited deficit spending. It allows sanctions that work. It allows the US to live beyond its means. As dollar dominance fades, all these advantages disappear. The US must balance its budget. The US military becomes unaffordable without unlimited borrowing. US living standards fall relative to the rest of the world. This doesn't mean America becomes poor. It means America becomes normal, a large, rich country, but not the hyperpower Europe loses along with the US. European countries tied themselves to the US dollar system. They joined US sanctions against Russia. They froze Russian reserves. They cut Russia off from SWIFT. This aligned Europe with US policy, but also tied Europe to dollar decline. Dollar holders lose wealth. Anyone holding dollar-denominated assets faces devaluation, not hyperinflation, not overnight collapse, but persistent 5 to 10% annual inflation as the dollar loses purchasing power. American consumers lose purchasing power. The US imports more than it exports. A trade deficit is about $800 billion per year. This is sustainable only because foreigners accept dollars. When they don't, the US must export more or import less. That means fewer goods, higher prices, lower living standards. If this analysis showed you a pattern you didn't see before, hit that subscribe button. The next 20 years of geopolitics will be defined by this transition from dollar dominance to multipolar currency competition. And I'll be here breaking down every step of the decline.